Outlaw's widow agreed to cook for a cowboy. Then found his face on her husband's poster. A desperate widow agreed to cook for a stranger because she needed the money. But when Clara found that wanted poster with her dead husband's name on it, she realized she'd been feeding Samuel's killer, and the truth about why he died would shatter everything she thought she knew about justice. The dust had settled on everything Clara Morrison owned, and still it wasn't enough to bury her grief. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the stranger approach through the heat shimmer that rose from the hardpan like ghosts. His horse moved with the careful gait of an animal that had traveled too far on too little water, and the man in the saddle sat with the kind of stillness that spoke of either patience or resignation. Clara couldn't tell which, and in these parts, it didn't much matter. The garden beside her cabin had given up weeks ago. Corn stalks stood like broken bones in the earth, their leaves curled and brown. She tried to keep them alive after Samuel died, tried to keep everything alive, but grief had a way of poisoning even the hardiest seeds. Now she had $3 to her name and a rent payment due that would take 10. Mom! The stranger touched the brim of his hat as he reined up near her fence. His voice carried the dust of long roads and longer silences. I was wondering if you might spare a meal for a traveler. Clara studied him from her doorway. He was lean in the way of men who ate when they could and went without when they had to. His clothes were clean but worn, mended in places with thread that didn't quite match. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of winter's sky, gray and distant, holding secrets she couldn't read. But it was his hands she noticed most. They rested gentle on the reins, scarred but careful, as if they knew the weight of things that could break. I don't run a restaurant, mister, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Those $3 felt lighter every time she thought about them. No, ma'am, I don't expect you to. He swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs. But I've got coin, and I haven't had a home-cooked meal in more weeks than I care to count. I'd pay fair for whatever you could spare. The word fair hung in the air between them like a prayer neither quite believed in. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one that came whenever she had to make decisions alone. Samuel would have known what to do. Samuel had always known. How much coin? She asked, hating herself for the need in her voice. The stranger reached into his vest pocket and pulled out $2 silver, holding them up so they caught the late afternoon light. This much. For supper and maybe breakfast, if you've got the provisions. $2 silver. More than she'd seen at once since the funeral. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. I've got salt pork and beans, she said. Cornbread if the meal holds out. Coffee that's mostly grounds by now. Sounds like a feast to me, ma'am. She stepped aside, and he followed her into the cabin. The interior was clean, but sparse, everything in its place because there wasn't much to keep. A table and 2 chairs, a cook stove that had seen better decades, shelves that held more empty space than supplies. The only decoration was a daguerreotype on the mantelpiece, a young man in a wedding suit, smiling at something beyond the camera's reach. The stranger glanced at the picture, but didn't ask. Clara was grateful for that. She'd grown tired of explaining Samuel to strangers, tired of watching their faces change when she mentioned how he'd died. Name's Clara Morrison, she said, moving to the stove. You can set yourself at the table. Much obliged, Mrs. Morrison. He settled into the chair that faced away from Samuel's picture. I'm grateful for your kindness. He didn't offer his own name, and Clara didn't ask. In her experience, men who traveled alone with good horses and careful hands often had reasons for keeping their names to themselves. As long as his coins were real, his secrets could stay his own. She worked in the familiar rhythm of cooking, soaking beans and slicing salt pork, mixing cornmeal with the last of her good flour. The stranger sat quiet at her table, but it wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of awkward strangers. It was the deep silence of someone who understood the value of not filling every moment with words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending something, paper maybe, or leaves, skittering across the yard. Clara glanced through the window and saw clouds building on the horizon, heavy and dark with the promise of rain that might or might not come. "Storm brewing," she said, more to break the silence than because it needed saying. "Yes, ma'am." The stranger followed her gaze. "Been tracking me for 2 days now. Seems like it's finally caught up." The way he said it made Clara wonder if he was talking about more than weather. But she kept that thought to herself and turned back to her cooking. The meal came together slowly, the way good food should. The cabin filled with the smell of browning pork and cornbread baking, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt something approaching contentment. There was comfort in cooking for someone again, in setting 2 places at the table instead of 1. When she served the plates, the stranger bowed his head for a moment before eating. Clara did the same, though she wasn't sure anymore who she was praying to. The food disappeared with the quiet efficiency of genuine hunger. The stranger ate like a man who'd learned not to waste anything, cleaning his plate with a piece of cornbread and drinking his coffee down to the grounds. "That was the finest meal I've had in months," he said when he finished. "You've got a gift, Mrs. Morrison." "Just practice," Clara replied, but she felt a flush of pride she hadn't experienced in far too long. Thunder rolled across the sky outside, closer now. The first drops of rain began to tick against the windows, and the stranger glanced toward the door. "I should see to my horse," he said. "Get her settled before this thing hits proper." "There's an old lean-to behind the cabin," Clara offered. "It's not much, but it'll keep her dry." "Much obliged." He stood and placed the 2 silver dollars on the table, then added a third. Clara stared at the extra coin. "That's more than we agreed on," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The stranger put his hat back on, settling it carefully. "But kindness is worth more than coins, and you show me plenty of both tonight." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "If it's all right with you, Mrs. Morrison, I'd like to take you up on that breakfast offer. I'll be moving on come morning, but I'd be grateful for one more taste of home cooking before I do." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. It had been so long since anyone had called her cooking home cooking. So long since her small cabin had felt like a home at all. The stranger stepped out into the growing storm, and Clara began clearing the dishes. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see him leading his horse toward the lean-to, moving with the same careful gentleness she'd noticed in his hands. She stacked the plates and wondered what kind of man carried himself with such quiet courtesy while riding alone through territory where decent folks traveled in groups. She wondered what secrets lived behind those winter sky eyes, and why a man with good manners and hard currency was eating at the table of a widow instead of in a proper town. But mostly, as thunder shook the cabin and rain drummed against the roof, Clara Morrison found herself looking forward to morning, and to one more meal shared with someone who understood the value of silence and the weight of gratitude. Outside in the storm, she could just make out the glow of the stranger's cigarette as he stood under the lean-to, keeping watch over his horse and perhaps over something else that only he could see. Clara thought she was just cleaning up after breakfast, until she found the wanted poster in his saddlebag with her dead husband's name on it, and the killer's face staring back at her from across the table where he'd just praised her biscuits. Dawn came quiet over the Morrison homestead, painting the storm-washed world in shades of gold and shadow. Clara woke to the sound of chopping wood, steady, rhythmic strikes that echoed across the yard like a heartbeat. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to find the stranger splitting logs beside the lean-to, his movements efficient and sure. He'd already stacked enough firewood to last her a month. "Morning, Mrs. Morrison," he called, setting down the axe. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the cool air, and there was something peaceful in his face that hadn't been there the night before. "Hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't have to do that," Clara said, though she felt a flutter of gratitude. Firewood had been another worry on her growing list, another task that Samuel's hands would never complete again. "Seemed like the least I could do." The stranger wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "That storm brought the temperature down some. You'll be grateful for the wood when the next cold snap hits." Clara nodded, watching him gather his things. His horse stood saddled and ready, saddlebags packed tight. Everything about him spoke of departure, of a man accustomed to leaving before he wore out his welcome. "I promised you breakfast," she said. "Only if it's no trouble, ma'am." I can make do with jerky and creek water, if need be. But Clara was already heading back inside. Cooking had become her anchor, the one thing that still made sense when everything else felt adrift. She mixed batter for flapjacks and sliced the last of her bacon, working in the comfortable rhythm that had sustained her through darker mornings than this. The stranger appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Smells like heaven in here," he said. "Set yourself down." "Won't be but a minute." They ate in the same companionable silence as the night before, but Clara found herself stealing glances at his face in the morning light. There was something familiar about the set of his jaw, the way he held his coffee cup. Nothing she could place exactly, just a nagging feeling that she'd seen those features before. "You heading far?" she asked, refilling his cup. "Far enough." His smile was gentle, but gave nothing away. "Got business in Tucson, if the weather holds." "That's a hard ride from here." "Yes, ma'am, but some rides can't be avoided." The way he said it made Clara think of Samuel, who'd taken his own hard ride 2 months ago, the one that ended with a bullet in his chest and a telegram that had torn her world in half. The authorities had called it a robbery gone wrong, said the killer had gotten away clean, left her with nothing but grief and the growing certainty that justice was a luxury she couldn't afford. The stranger finished his meal and stood, placing another silver dollar on the table. "That's too much again," Clara protested. "No, ma'am, it's not nearly enough." He put on his hat and touched the brim. "You've given me something I hadn't tasted in a long while." "What's that?" "Kindness without questions. That's rarer than silver in these parts." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know, meeting you has reminded me that there's still good in this world. Sometimes a man can forget that, traveling the roads I've traveled." Before Clara could respond, he was gone, leaving her with the lingering scent of leather and horse and something else she couldn't name, something that felt like regret. She watched from the window as he loaded his saddlebags and checked his horse's cinch. There was care in every movement, the attention of a man who understood that survival often depended on details. His horse nuzzled his shoulder, and he spoke to her in words too soft for Clara to hear. Then he was mounted and riding away, disappearing into the morning haze like a fever dream. Clara stood at the window long after he'd gone, coffee growing cold in her cup. The silence felt different now, not the heavy quiet of loneliness, but the contemplative hush that follows unexpected grace. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed simple human conversation, the rhythm of shared meals and careful courtesies. It wasn't until she began clearing the breakfast dishes that she noticed it. A piece of paper lay on the floor beside the table, yellowed and creased as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. It must have fallen from the stranger's pocket or saddlebag when he'd reached for his coins. Clara bent to pick it up, thinking to catch him before he got too far down the trail. The paper unfolded in her hands like a curse. "Wanted, dead or alive," read the bold letters across the top. Below them, a rough sketch stared back at her. The same winter sky eyes, the same weathered face, the same careful mouth that had thanked her for her kindness not 10 minutes before. But it was the name at the bottom that stopped her heart. Jack Morrison, 500 reward. Wanted for the murder of Samuel Morrison, July 15th, territory of Arizona. The paper trembled in Clara's hands as if it were alive. Morrison, the same name as hers, the same name as Samuel's. She read it again, certain her eyes were playing tricks, but the words remained unchanged. Jack Morrison, wanted for killing Samuel Morrison. Her husband's killer had sat at her table, had eaten her food and slept in her lean-to and split wood for her winter fire, had looked her in the eye and spoken of kindness while carrying a wanted poster with her dead husband's name written in official ink. The coffee cup slipped from her other hand and shattered on the floor, but Clara barely heard it. All she could hear was the stranger's voice, Jack's voice, saying Samuel's name. But when had he said it? Her memory felt fractured, unreliable. She sank into the chair he'd just vacated, the wanted poster spread before her like evidence of some cosmic joke. The sketch wasn't perfect. Wanted posters never were. But the resemblance was unmistakable. Those were the same hands that had held his fork with such careful grace, the same mouth that had called her cooking a gift. Clara tried to remember everything he'd said, every gesture, every look. Had there been guilt in his eyes when he glanced at Samuel's daguerreotype? Recognition? Or had she imagined it all, her grief-addled mind reading meaning into innocent glances? The reward was $500, more money than she'd seen in her lifetime, enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere without memories buried in every corner. All she had to do was ride to the sheriff's office in town and show them the poster. Tell them which direction Jack Morrison had ridden. But even as she thought it, Clara knew she couldn't move. Her legs felt rooted to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The man who'd killed Samuel, sweet, gentle Samuel who wouldn't harm a fly, had just thanked her for reminding him that there was still good in the world. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm coming, or perhaps the same one returning to finish what it had started. Clara folded the wanted poster with trembling fingers, creasing it along the same worn lines that spoke of long carrying and frequent reference. Jack Morrison had been carrying his own wanted poster. The thought struck her like a physical blow. He'd known exactly who he was, exactly what he'd done. Had known it when he'd asked for a meal, when he'd split her firewood, when he'd spoken of kindness and grace. Had known it and come anyway, drawn perhaps by the same cruel magnetism that had brought Clara face to face with her husband's killer in the most impossible way imaginable. She rose from the table on unsteady legs and walked to the window. The trail stretched empty in both directions, dust already settling where his horse's hooves had stirred it. Jack Morrison was gone, swallowed by the vastness that had hidden him for 2 months. But he would stop somewhere, would need water, supplies, another meal from another kind stranger who didn't know the weight of the name he carried. The poster in Clara's hands was proof that others were hunting him, that his face was known and his crime remembered. $500 for the man who'd called her cooking a gift. Clara smoothed the wanted poster against the table, studying the sketch with eyes that now saw only truth. Samuel's killer had beautiful hands and careful manners and a way of sitting quietly that spoke of deep wells of regret. He split firewood like a man trying to atone for something, and he spoke of goodness as if he'd forgotten he deserved any for himself. The morning light slanted through her windows, illuminating the silver dollars he'd left on her table. Payment for meals shared with the widow of the man he'd killed, coins that felt heavier now than grief itself. Clara picked up one of the dollars and held it to the light, wondering if blood money shone differently than honest wages, wondering if she could spend it without thinking of the hands that had earned it and the life those same hands had taken. The storm clouds gathered overhead, and Clara Morrison sat at her kitchen table with a wanted poster and 3 silver dollars, trying to decide what justice looked like when it wore a kind face and left you firewood for the winter ahead. When Jack Morrison came back to face the widow whose husband he'd killed, Clara set that wanted poster right between the cornbread and coffee, and what he told her about Samuel's death would change everything she thought she knew about justice. Clara Morrison had been sitting at her kitchen table for 3 hours when she heard the horse returning. The wanted poster lay spread before her like a tarot card promising nothing but sorrow, its edges weighted down with the silver dollars that had bought her husband's killer 2 meals and a night's shelter. She'd read every word so many times the letters seemed burned into her vision. Jack Morrison, 500 reward, murder of Samuel Morrison. The sketch had grown more familiar with each viewing until she could trace every line of that weathered face from memory. Clara stepped aside without speaking. What words existed for a moment like this? Jack entered and stood just inside the threshold, as if crossing too far into her space would compound his crimes. His gaze fell on the kitchen table where the wanted poster lay in full view, and something in his face crumpled. Not surprise, but the relief of a man finally allowed to set down a burden too heavy for carrying. "I dropped it yesterday morning," he said quietly. "Didn't realize until I was 5 miles down the trail." He looked at Clara with eyes that held no plea for mercy, no expectation of forgiveness. "I came back because you deserve to know." "Know what?" Clara's voice came out as a whisper. That I fed my husband's killer? That I took money from the man who made me a widow? Jack flinched as if she'd struck him, but he didn't look away. You deserve to know the whole truth, not just what's written on that paper. Clara gestured toward the table, her hands shaking. The truth is right there in black and white. Jack Morrison, wanted for murder. Samuel Morrison, dead by your hand. Yes, ma'am, that's the truth, but it's not all of it. Jack moved slowly to the table, not sitting but standing behind the chair where he'd eaten breakfast, where he'd spoken of kindness and goodness as if he still deserved either. He looked down at the wanted poster with the expression of a man studying his own gravestone. Samuel Morrison was your husband, he said, and hearing Samuel's name in the killer's mouth made Clara's chest tighten with fresh grief. But he was also my brother. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She gripped the back of her chair, certain she'd misheard. Your brother? Half-brother, Jack corrected, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Same father, different mothers. Samuel was the good son, the one who got the family name and the blessing. I was the mistake, the reminder of a night Papa wanted to forget. Clara shook her head, denying what couldn't be denied. Samuel never mentioned a brother. No, ma'am, I don't expect he did. We hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since the day I left home with nothing but a horse and the knowledge that I'd never measure up to Samuel Morrison's shadow. Jack's fingers traced the edge of the wanted poster, not quite touching it. But blood calls to blood, Mrs. Morrison. Even when you don't want it to. Even when you've spent half your life running from it. Then why? Clara's voice broke on the word. Why did you kill him? Jack closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Clara saw tears threatening to spill. Because he was trying to save me. The story came out in pieces, like shards of broken glass that cut with each revelation. Jack had been running from a botched robbery in Prescott, wounded and desperate, when he'd stumbled across Samuel's camp. Samuel, who'd been riding to town for supplies, who'd recognized his half-brother despite 15 years and a face hardened by regret. He tended my wound, Jack said, his voice barely audible. Shared his food and his fire, just like you did. Told me about his wife, how happy he was, how he'd finally found peace in this territory. Clara felt the room spinning around her. Samuel had never mentioned meeting anyone on that last ride, had simply kissed her goodbye and promised to be back by evening. But he'd been delayed, hadn't he? Had sent word he'd be staying overnight in town. The law found us at dawn, Jack continued. Someone had tracked me from Prescott, and Samuel. His voice broke entirely. Samuel stood between them and me. Said I was his brother. Said he'd vouch for me. Take me to term myself in proper like. Jack's hands were shaking now, the tremor spreading up his arms like a fever. But the sheriff, he didn't want to hear about surrendering. Said there'd been too much trouble, too much killing. Said it was easier to end it right there. The sheriff shot Samuel? Clara whispered. No, ma'am. Jack's voice was barely a breath. The sheriff was drawing on me, and Samuel stepped in front of the gun. He looked up at Clara, with eyes full of the pain that seemed to match her own. The bullet was meant for me. Samuel took it in the chest, and he was smiling when he did it. Smiling like he'd finally done something that mattered. Clara sank in her chair, the world tilting beneath her. But the wanted poster says you killed him. I did. Jack's voice was steady now, carrying the weight of absolute truth. Not with a gun, but just as sure. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't brought trouble to his camp, Samuel Morrison would still be alive. Would still be coming home to you every evening, splitting firewood and tending that garden you can't seem to keep alive. The silence that followed felt heavy as a gravestone. Clara stared at the wanted poster, seeing it differently now. Not the face of a cold-blooded killer, but the haunted features of a man carrying guilt that belonged to him and grief that didn't. The sheriff let you go? She asked. Sheriff was dead too, Jack said quietly. His deputy got spooked when Samuel fell, started shooting wild. I put a bullet in the sheriff's heart and another in his gun hand, then rode out with my brother's blood on my shirt and his last words ringing in my ears. What did he say? Jack's smile was bitter and beautiful at once. He said, Tell Clara I'm sorry for being late for supper again. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob that felt torn from her very soul. Those words, so perfectly Samuel, so exactly what he would say even as he lay dying. She could hear his voice saying them, could see his gentle smile and the way his eyes would crinkle when he made light of serious things. "You came here to tell me," she whispered. "I came here to die," Jack corrected. "I've been carrying that poster for 2 months, hoping someone would recognize me and end this. But then you showed me kindness, and I remembered what Samuel died for, what he saw in the world that was worth protecting." Jack reached into his vest and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it carefully on the table beside the wanted poster. "That's everything I took from the robbery in Prescott. Every dollar. I've been looking for a way to make it right, but there's no right to be found in any of this." Clara opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Gold coins spilled across the table, more money than she'd ever seen in one place. Enough to pay her debts, buy a new life, start over anywhere she chose. "I don't want it," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I know. But Samuel died trying to save me, and I can't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Can't let his widow lose her home because his brother brought trouble to his door." Jack straightened, squaring his shoulders. "The choice is yours now, Mrs. Morrison. Turn me in for the bounty, or let me ride away to face whatever justice finds me down the trail. Either way, I wanted you to know the truth. Samuel Morrison died a hero, protecting family that didn't deserve it." Clara looked at the wanted poster, then at the gold coins, then at the face of the man who'd killed her husband by loving him. The weight of choice pressed down on her like the lid of a coffin, and she wondered if this was what justice felt like. Not the clean satisfaction she'd imagined, but the terrible burden of holding another person's fate in your hands. Outside, storm clouds gathered again, and Clara Morrison sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by wanted posters and blood money, trying to find her way through a darkness that had no map and no clear destination. The truth, she realized, was heavier than grief and more complicated than revenge. And somewhere in that complexity, in the space between justice and mercy, she would have to decide what Samuel's death had really meant and what his brother's life was worth. Clara Morrison had a choice: turn in her husband's killer for $500, or let him ride away into the desert. But what she did instead would teach both of them that mercy sometimes grows in the most unlikely soil. Dawn came like absolution over the Morrison homestead, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. Clara had not slept, but she felt strangely rested, as if the long night of wrestling with truth had cleansed something from her soul that had been poisoning it for months. Jack Morrison sat in the chair across from her, the wanted poster folded between his hands like a prayer he couldn't finish saying. He hadn't slept either. Had spent the hours before sunrise sitting vigil with his guilt, waiting for Clara to decide whether he would meet his end at the gallows or on some lonely stretch of desert trail. The gold coins from Prescott lay scattered across the table like fallen stars, and the silver dollars he'd paid for his meals sat beside them. Blood money and honest wages mixed together until Clara could no longer tell the difference. Money was just money, she'd realized somewhere in the dark hours before dawn. It was what you did with it that carried weight. "I've made my choice," Clara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Jack looked up, and she saw him steel himself for judgment. His winter sky eyes held no plea, no bargaining, just the calm acceptance of a man who'd already died in every way that mattered. "I'm going to let you ride away," Clara continued, and watched something crack in Jack's careful composure. "But not for the reasons you think." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where nothing had grown since Samuel's death. The corn stalks stood like monuments to failure, their brown leaves rustling in the morning breeze. "Samuel always said a man should be judged by what he does after he makes his worst mistake," she said. "Not by the mistake itself, but by how he carries it forward." Clara turned back to Jack, who was staring at her as if she were speaking in tongues. "You've been carrying Samuel's death like a stone in your chest for 2 months, she said, "punishing yourself in ways the law never could. That's not what my husband died for. Mrs. Morrison, he died protecting his brother," Clara interrupted, her voice gaining strength. He died believing you could be saved. If I turn you in now, if I let them hang you for a bullet meant for your heart, then Samuel's death means nothing. His sacrifice becomes just another tragedy in a territory that's already got too many. Jack's hands trembled as he unfolded the wanted poster, smoothing it against the table. The law says you killed Samuel Morrison, Clara said firmly. But the truth says Samuel Morrison chose to die for Jack Morrison. And I won't make a liar out of my husband's last act on this earth. She moved to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast with the deliberate movements of a woman who had found her purpose. Flapjacks and coffee, the last of the good bacon. A final meal for a man about to be reborn or die trying. There are conditions, she said as she worked. You take that gold back to Prescott. Every dollar. You make restitution to whoever you robbed. Face whatever consequences come with it. Yes, ma'am. And you write to me. Once a month, just a line or two. Let me know you're still honoring what Samuel died for. Jack's voice was barely a whisper. And if I don't? If I disappoint you the way I disappointed everyone else? Clara set the plate before him and looked into eyes that held more pain than any man should carry. Then you'll have to live with being the kind of man who let his brother die for nothing. I figure that's punishment enough for any crime. They ate in silence, but it was a different quiet than before. Not the careful distance of strangers, but the contemplative hush of two people who had walked through fire together and emerged changed. The morning light slanted through the windows, illuminating the gold coins that would soon begin their journey back to their rightful owners. When Jack finished eating, he stood and gathered the money into the leather pouch, his movements precise and ceremonial. He folded the wanted poster and tucked it into his vest pocket, carrying his own death sentence as he'd carried it for months. Mrs. Morrison, he said, and there was something different in his voice. Not the hollow resignation of the night before, but the tentative hope of a man remembering what it felt like to deserve mercy. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me, Clara replied. Thanks, Samuel. Every choice you make from here on, every good thing you do with whatever time you have left, that's your thanks to him. Jack nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared prayer. He put on his hat and moved toward the door, then paused. Your garden, he said. It's not too late to plant again. Ground like this, with enough water and patience, it'll grow anything. I don't seem to have the touch for it anymore. Maybe you've just been trying to grow the wrong things. Jack's smile was tentative but real. Sometimes the best crops come from the worst seasons, if you're willing to tend them proper. He stepped out into the morning light, and Clara followed him to the porch. His horse nickered softly as he approached, and Jack spoke to her in the same gentle tones Clara remembered from that first night. There was care in his movements, tenderness in the way he checked her cinch and adjusted her bridle. The letters, Clara called as he swung into the saddle. What name should I look for? Jack considered this, sitting tall in the saddle with the morning sun painting his face in gold. Samuel Morrison, he said finally. If it's all right with you, ma'am, I'd like to try being the kind of man who deserves to carry that name. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but they were clean tears, not the bitter salt of grief, but something closer to rain after drought. I think he'd like that. Jack touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that had become familiar and somehow precious. Until next month, then. Until next month. Clara watched him ride away, not disappearing into heat shimmer this time, but solid and real against the morning sky. She stood on her porch until the dust settled, until even the memory of hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the desert. Then she walked to her kitchen and gathered the silver dollars he'd left behind, payment for meals that had cost them both more than either could have imagined. She took the coins and walked out to the failed garden, kneeling among the broken corn stalks and withered bean vines. The earth felt different under her hands, not the hard pan of despair, but soil waiting for the right season. Clara began clearing away the dead plants, pulling up the brown remnants of her failed attempts at growing life in grief-poisoned ground. By noon, she had cleared a small patch of earth. By evening, she had planted beans and corn and squash, the three sisters that would grow together, supporting each other through the seasons ahead. She watered them with precious well water and her own tears, baptizing the seeds with salt and hope in equal measure. As the sun set over the Morrison homestead, Clara sat on her porch and opened Samuel's Bible to a page she'd never been able to read before, the one about forgiveness being a gift you give yourself. The words made sense now in ways they never had when her heart was full of poison. Somewhere in the desert, Jack Morrison rode toward Prescott with a pouch full of stolen gold and a new name to grow into. Somewhere in the future, letters would come bearing news of restitution made and chances taken, of a man trying to become worthy of his brother's sacrifice. And in the garden behind the cabin, seeds slept in patient earth, dreaming of the harvest to come. Not the bitter fruit of revenge, but the sustaining grain of mercy, planted by hands that had learned the difference between justice and grace. The first letter would arrive in 28 days, signed in a careful hand, Samuel Morrison, trying to do better. And Clara would write back, as she would every month for years to come, tending the fragile correspondence between a widow and the man who'd killed her husband by learning to love him. But on this night, as stars emerged over the desert and cool wind rustled through the planet Earth, Clara Morrison sat on her porch and felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. The quiet contentment of a woman who had chosen mercy over justice and found that the choice had somehow chosen her back. In the garden, invisible in the darkness but undeniably present, the first tender shoots of forgiveness began their long journey toward the light. Somewhere in the desert, Jack Morrison rode toward Prescott with a pouch full of stolen gold and a new name to grow into. Somewhere in the future, letters would come bearing news of restitution made and chances taken, of a man trying to become worthy of his brother's sacrifice. And in the garden behind the cabin, seeds slept in patient earth, dreaming of the harvest to come. Not the bitter fruit of revenge, but the sustaining grain of mercy, planted by hands that had learned the difference between justice and grace. The first letter would arrive in 28 days, signed in a careful hand, Samuel Morrison, trying to do better. And Clara would write back, as she would every month for years to come, tending the fragile correspondence between a widow and the man who'd killed her husband by learning to love him. But on this night, as stars emerged over the desert and cool wind rustled through the planet Earth, Clara Morrison sat on her porch and felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death. The quiet contentment of a woman who had chosen mercy over justice and found that the choice had somehow chosen her back. In the garden, invisible in the darkness but undeniably present, the first tender shoots of forgiveness began their long journey toward the light. In the garden, invisible in the darkness but undeniably present, the first tender shoots of forgiveness began their long journey toward the light.